The sense we have is that in the vast expanses of space between celestial bodies, there is void, hence total silence. The Greek word for space is diastema, which means literally in between. It is not surprising that the word was used initially to determine the space between sounds, since the understanding of sound, and of course music, was essential in the ancient Greek contemplation of the universe. What Pierre Schaeffer, the founder of musique concrète, would come to call the acousmatic experience, the ancient Greeks considered to be fundamental to physics. One listens to the universe before anything else. Perhaps a century from now, if humanity continues to exist on this planet, September 14, 2015 will mark the date of another sort of Copernican revolution. On that day, LIGO, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, recorded the sound of two black holes colliding about 1.2 billion years ago. LIGO is a giant listening machine focused on the outer edges of the universe. A pair of L-shaped observatories located 1,900 miles apart were ultra-pure mirrors at the end of each arm, isolated from vibrations, were set up to detect passing gravitational waves. Except that gravitational waves, until this moment, existed only in theory. Einstein's general theory of relativity that predicted mathematically the folding of space as a result of massive gravitational ebbs and flows. The LIGO machine registered the universe's confirmation of a human being's theory, which is based, like all theoretical physics, on the assumption that the universe works according to an unwavering mathematics, even if provisionally such mathematics are unobservable or untestable in any physical sense. Numbers on this occasion are stunning all around, at both macro and micro levels. The energy released from the collision 1.2 billion years ago of two black holes the size of 36 and 29 suns each, is calculated to be 50 times greater than the output of all the stars of the universe combined. This inconceivable space storm that produced a glitch in the folds of space moved the LIGO mirrors by a mere 4/1000ths of the diameter of a proton, which itself is 10 to the minus 15 meters. The gravitational space fold produced a swishing sound moving across the range of low to middle C that lasts barely 3 seconds. So I want to see if we can hear that. That was twice. Whoa, I want to hear it again. Okay, there we go. 3 seconds. Beyond the significance of the fact that the last part of Einstein's theoretical prediction was finally confirmed, the most important thing in this whole affair is this chirp. If Galileo inaugurated modern astronomy's reliance on telescopic vision, now expanded across the electromagnetic spectrum, the LIGO event has changed the paradigm. As Zambos Marca, a Columbia University scientist who's a member of the LIGO project, put it, everything else in astronomy is the eye, but finally astronomy grew ears. We never had ears before. An extraordinary realization to my mind, given that from the days of Thales and Anaximander of Miletus in the 6th century BCE, the physics of the universe exceeded the visual domain. Before being the object of abstract mathematical thought, the universe is foremost an acousmatic experience. Silence is its in-between. It begs us to listen. Legend has it that young pupils of Pythagoras had to spend 5 years in silence listening to the philosopher's words behind a curtain, what later came to be known as the Pythagorean veil, so that in fact the words and their meaning would resonate without interference from the image of the person speaking. Here, both masking and silence work together to induce a condition of utmost listening. A kind of embodied understanding requires some sort of de-identification, or perhaps even depersonalization, without the pathological meaning this came to have in psychiatry. Of both speaker and listener. So de-identification and depersonalization of both speaker and listener. The visual representation of authority occupies the terrain of speech and curiously disembodies it by attaching it to a face, a persona. The very Latin etymology of the word contains this essence, the object through which sound passes altogether literally, persona. It is quite strange indeed, for the face, the persona, is already an image discorporated from the sensuous network that retains signification as a fully embodied experience. This is yet another reason why masks were essential in every mode of archaic theater in a number of societies. While remaining a visual medium, they subverted the privileged relation of the visual to identity. Listening, more than speaking, is essential to autonomous understanding. I mean autonomous in its literally political sense. Indeed, more than a domain of free speech, democracy is a state of listening. From the outset, the social imaginary of the democratic polity privileged speech metaphors, to be sure, the explicit interrogation of written law, the free and fearless exchange of opinions in the marketplace, etc., even if people oftentimes fell into the seductive trap of a singular master guiding oratory, demagogues. Yet, without being configured as a space of listening, the Athenian demos would have been dysfunctional. We see this as late as the period when the Apostle Paul visited Athens in his evangelical peregrinations. As we know from what is written in the Acts, Athenians granted Paul their most attentive listening, even if they remained unconvinced by his belief in the resurrection, which they found preposterous. Like the case of Paul, the story of the Pythagorean veil is legend, a mythical structure whose historical authenticity is irrelevant, because myth itself establishes an indisputable reality across time. The history of the Pythagoreans is replete with legendary elements. It's not an accident. Their mystical relation to knowledge presupposes and facilitates this mythical structure. So in this respect, the veil is just as much a metaphor for the extensively mediated structure of achieving knowledge. Knowledge is indirect and participatory. No one is a mere reception point, a vessel to be filled, capitalist techno-consumerism notwithstanding. Both masking and listening from a certain form a certain sort of language for this indirectness, an articulation that interrupts the need to put a face to a name or a word to a thing. Likewise, silence too is a mask, for it enables a more profound acousmatic exchange, the kind of listening that disrupts one's reliance on mere response to external stimuli. Despite the hegemonic power of information models in contemporary thought, the human animal resists the categorization of machine. It learns to live by creating the knowledge situation, not by obeying it or merely responding to it. In fact, the astonishing thing in the human being is not that it learns, but that it doesn't. This basic notion among the Greeks of listening as learning to be persisted for centuries, even while the Greek world changed significantly in terms of politics or social organization. Foucault is explicitly attentive to it in his research on the practices of the care of the self, which was the key element in the Stoic way of life. A remarkable lecture in the hermeneutics of the subject, that's 81, 82, that has not received due attention, is explicitly focused on the significance of listening in the practices of the Stoics. Drawing on Plutarch's essential essay on listening, Foucault exhorts listening as a neglected domain in the process of learning, which for him is an insurmountable element of subjectivation. Given his interests at that point in his life, his focus was on how listening pertains to truth-telling, which, I remind us here, has nothing to do with adherence to some concept of truth that one must serve, but rather to parrhesia, the practice of giving voice to oneself unencumbered and unconcealed, a decidedly bodily action of being as such, devoid of ends and instrumentalities. While I will not elaborate here on the complex and different politics of parrhesia in various historical moments of ancient Greek life, I will note that discussions of this notion inevitably center on the function of speech and almost never on listening. This includes Foucault, aside from this unusual moment. And yet, what would be the political meaning of parrhesia without the sort of polity of listening that feels it, judges it, and is permeated by it? Foucault here is reading texts of philosophy while meditating on the significance of bodily practices that would undo the mentality of docile bodies. His purpose is political as much as existential, but because he's reading philosophers, he focuses on listening to logos. Hence his attention to how we listen to words and all that this immediately conjures and opens up. Who speaks the words? What do these words mean? What do I do with the meaning of these words? How do I judge? Yet he fields these questions by focusing relentlessly on the body, how one sits, where one moves, how one desires, how one is dressed, where does one go from the scene. And he does so following the terms in which these ancient texts themselves describe the acquisition of listening as a skill, yet a skill that is defined as experience, not techne. An experience that must then be performed in order to realize the process of transformation that creates a subject, the process of, in his words, subjectivation. I have to underline here that listening as a skill is not a techne, but experience. This experience is hardly passive. We're speaking of the exercise of learning, after all. Whether in the context of the mystical Pythagorean myth of the veil or the Stoic de-eroticized confrontation of self and other through teaching learning, the process is explicitly active even when it engages, as it must, in the exercise of silence. I remind us again that Foucault makes justly clear that the notion of ascesis, which was essential to the vocabulary of the Stoics, has nothing ascetic about it as the term has come to be understood in Christian and subsequently Christianized parameters. Ascesis involves no renunciation, no withdrawal, not even a certain kind of sublimation, particularly if by the latter we allow ourselves tacitly to signify a process of repression or retreat from the body. On the contrary, the ascesis of the listening experience, which must always involve silence in some fashion, is an active corporeal engagement with the other on the way toward transforming, I would say othering, oneself. I'm going to skip the Foucault quotations, which are long, but they really basically talk about how listening is always in some way self-directed and self-actualizing. Of course, I repeat, Foucault is interested in the philosophical encounter and the practice of truth-telling. Therefore, his rumination on listening is specifically attuned to logos, which is to say inevitably to a certain semantic register, to language as a specific system of meaning that attaches words to things. My own concern is way beyond this, as I care especially for the meaning of wordless sound, which would include words spoken or sung, screamed, whispered, or vocalized to the extent that we can bracket their primary relation to things and return to them their simple resonance. I'll come back to this at the end. Indeed, if we could comport ourselves for a minute and recover from the seductive obsession that the Greeks means philosophy, we might recognize that logos was hardly the most important word in the Greek vocabulary. Instead, one can argue that their evident attention to language was primarily constituted and driven by their expressed attention to sound. After all, their singular linguistic innovation was creating signs for vowels to attach to the alphabetic notation they inherited from the Phoenicians. The literature on this matter is huge and contentious, but there is no doubt that the phonetic nuances of their language were so complex and essential to meaning that the whole gravity of communication was enabled by a musical sensibility. To quote Flora Levin from her magisterial treatise, Greek Reflections on the Nature of Music, the ancient Greek language was itself a form of melodious expression, since to distort the pitch accent was tantamount to committing an egregious grammatical error. Inasmuch as the disseminated and celebrated imaginarium of the Greeks is a modern European invention, under the semantic compulsion of philosophical and theological privilege, the simple fact that the Greek texts were written for the ear first and not for the abstract mind has been denied. Hence, the complex parameters of the practices these texts stirred and substantiated have also been, in this respect, displaced at a core level, since the adoring moderns played the Greeks for ideas, not sensations, further honing their own constitutive mind-body split. And I'm referring to the entire range of the Greek world, from the cosmological invocation of harmony in violence and vice versa. I'm thinking a lot of Mohammed's talk this morning, as the basic framework of the universe, and the astronomical understanding that celestial bodies are connected to vibrations that permeate earthly bodies, to the raucous intoxication and existential corporeality of the theater, and the very essence of politics itself, which in the democratic phase reached a contrapuntal apex. To return then, in this light, to the Pythagorean acousmatic experience, I would focus not so much on the obvious deprivileging of the hegemony of the visual, but on something more elemental, the separation of the senses. Because then we would see how a paradoxical condition emerges. The separation of the senses produces in turn a sort of synesthesia, with listening at the helm, organizing the entire experience. Indeed, what Pierre Schaeffer saw in the Pythagorean occasion was a model for how sound can be disengaged from its source, whether visual or sonic, so that a new way of encountering sound can emerge, so that the experience of listening can transform with the very sense of hearing. We can imagine the Pythagorean veil as a kind of phonograph avant la lettre, a device of separating the sound from its source that is just as technological as any of those devices that modernity claims exclusively as its own. The wager of musique concrète is how the ear will suspend its impression that sound comes from a person who creates it musically through an instrument that physically makes it happen, so that sound itself can be synthesized as a self-constituted auditory event. Hence, the silences in the musical space, the asthma, are essential elements of this synthesis. Of course, a great many contemporary composers relied extensively on this poetics of silence. But I would argue this to be the case also in musique concrète and what eventually has been called the aesthetics of noise, the very opposite of silence, strictly speaking. Saturated sound, in disrupting the spacing of established harmony, creates conditions of listening that resemble the acousmatic experience of silence. When the legendary Sun Ra, in the midst of the orchestra's most out-there improvisations, deemed that an interruption or change of direction was needed, he would give a signal for a space chord, a collectively improvised cluster of notes played by the full band at deafening volume. This you have to hear loud. Let's see if we can get this. No, that's your, sorry. Where it is, here it is. The saturated cluster was meant as an instant mood changer by mobilizing profound registers of listening, where listening would not invoke the more conventionally understood notion of slowly developing processing of sound, but the exact opposite, a blast across the broadest range of sound that would, in a moment's notice, deconstitute any sort of habitual attachment to what had been going on, in order to create an instantaneous orientation towards something else, a kind of piercing call for attention. This call is addressed to both musicians and the audience. It's not as if the musicians are already in the know. He would signal this at any point. The acousmatic experience pertains to everyone in the room. In this case, the master, Sun Ra, need not be hidden behind a veil, since his resplendent visual presence is already constituted by means of a mythical masking that covers every aspect of his presence, including his very name and provenance. I'm presuming that some of you don't know about Sun Ra, so I will say a few things. Sun Ra may have been born Herman Poole Blount in Birmingham, Alabama in 1914, but he came from the planet Saturn. When people questioned him about the details of his birth and name, he would respond, "That's his story. My story is mystery." His extraordinary passage through planet Earth confirms his mythical stature. He claimed that he was sent to the planet to undo its discordant condition. And he applied himself to this task with uncanny devotion and discipline, carrying forth a dedicated group of musicians from mid-50s Chicago to 60s New York and then Philadelphia until his death, all living together in commune conditions, rehearsing nearly all hours of the day and night, except when they were publicly performing. These were rehearsals just in name, or perhaps they were in fact rehearsals for a way of life to come in a totally reorchestrated planet, because they were continuously recorded and released through an independent production network, Saturn Research, which rejected the ways of the capitalist market decades before musicians realized the importance of owning their means of production and distribution. The many hundreds of records produced in this fashion, with hand-painted covers and obscure, sometimes deliberately confusing information as to their sources and whereabouts, were delivered hand-to-hand in various public performances and worked entirely within the myth-making framework of Sun Ra and his orchestra, which has a whole bunch of names that I will not read, as a pioneering force in what has come to be known as Afrofuturism. Despite Sun Ra's central place in the history of jazz and his extraordinary restaging of the entire history of African American music and beyond, it's difficult to categorize Sun Ra's music, which, to be accurate, means not just the music as such, but the entire world of the orchestra, the professed vision, the myth-making, the theatricality, the cosmological theory, the poetry, the manipulation of sound-making either through amateur constructing of instruments or electroacoustic experiments before they became widely practiced, or the very practice of a way of life or arts of living as they would have been known in archaic societies. He often commanded his musicians to play not what they know, but what they don't know, confounding thus the very parameters of learning. In 1966, he recorded 2 discs of the orchestra wind musicians playing string instruments in a deliberate attempt to displace their already remarkable horned expertise under his relentless tutelage and to invite new modes of listening against the grain of what is known. A significant part of Sun Ra's repertoire was what he called space chants, vocal pieces quite literally chanted by nearly everyone in the orchestra, with either Sonny himself or his primary singer and dancer, June Tyson, riffing some sort of counter melody. For an experienced listener, the chants carried the entire history of Black American music, including obviously recognizable African ritual chants and various doo-wop-derived harmonies and counterpoints. But the words were often didactic in a strict sense, instructions as to how one might engage with this abject world. The overt space content of these words was the mythical framework for the Black experience, Black myth as such, as Sun Ra himself explicitly put it. But in their performative essence, regardless what the words signified or alluded to, what thing they referred to, the chants were there, interspersed amidst the wildest sounds from wind, percussive, and electronic instruments, as a reminder of the most elemental sound of the Black experience, the voice, the body as instrument, the deracinated, deprived, fugitive body, instrument of others for others, but nonetheless indomitable and unconquerable sound-making register of its own autonomous, autopoetic existence. And I'm using here Sylvia Wynter's words, of course. Now, I won't go into Sun Ra's chants here. This would take way too long. But I will close with 3 examples. They're basically a minute each, so there's only 3 more minutes. From the use of the voice from a whole other register. Well, not entirely, but you will see it. And I won't really comment on them. I think that we can discuss them we can maybe discuss them. Let's see. Here, the first one. The first one is from, it's a minute from a piece by one of the late pieces of Julius Eastman, who I've been studying and writing about separately, as a kind of an extraordinary instance of black experimentalism and queer life in New York City. This is the piece, The Holy Presence of Joan of Arc. I remind everyone that Eastman was a composer, but as in he was a great, incredible pianist and also an incredible singer. I mean, that's...
John, Saint Michael said, Saint Catherine said, Saint Margaret said, John, speak, 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 Saint Margaret said.
The second one is another minute from a piece that called Memoriam, sung by Helga Davis, who's just an unbelievable singer, sings 5 octaves, and Jeffrey Ziegler playing the cello. These are great, they're amazing musicians, great friends of mine. And the third one is completely different. This is an amateur recording from the island of Rhodes in Greece. A woman is calling on her goats in a language that is incomprehensible to me. It's a dialect. Saying, come my girls, come my daughters, come my girls. The rest I don't really understand. hear the wind and the bells, etc. That's part of the whole listening. Thank you very much.